Now, I'd like to look at the, first of all, the daily ritual, the morning and evening sacrifice. Now, the problem is that we use, this is just typically modern, we use general terms, and by using general terms, we level everything out, and we sort of find something that lies in common behind all of the things, and we evaporate everything by generalizing and using general concepts. There's no general term for sacrifice in the Old Testament. The commonest, the most general term is what am I? Korban. Qarav is to draw near or bring near. A korban is an offering, something that is brought near and presented to God. Now what we're talking about here is two things: the olah, which is a burnt offering, the daily olah, and that is combined with the mincha, the cereal offering, the grain offering. Now, every morning, every evening, the divine service is enacted in Israel. Now, on the face of it, it looks as if people are bringing a meal to God, because what they do is to bring the basic food stuff: meat, bread, wine. Meat, bread, wine. So every morning, every evening, a male lamb is burnt on the altar, together with some grain, some flour, wheat flour, and that's mixed with olive oil. And wine is poured out on the altar. And the flour is mixed with incense, so that when you put the flour on the altar, it produces a sweet cloud of smoke. Now, you need to know that in the ancient world, as I've said already before, people didn't eat meat every day. They ate it only on special occasions. So this is not an ordinary meal, but a special meal that's offered, looks as if it's offered to God every morning and every evening. But everything is topsy-turvy, because the food isn't brought into God's presence in the Holy of Holies, but it's burnt up here on the altar. And here you get another paradox. God takes the offerings that he brings to the people. The offerings are of their basic food stuff. And the people present that food stuff to God at the time that they have their meals, morning and evening, not to provide a meal for God, but for God to provide a meal for his priests. And on festive occasions, a meal for his people. Notice the food stuff. Secondly, as I've already indicated, every morning, every evening is a meeting between God and his people. Exodus 29 is the key text for the theology of worship in the Old Testament. I give you here my own literal translation. Beware of translators, they're traitors. This comes immediately after the law for the establishment of the altar. You get the thing that's done on the altar, the morning and evening sacrifice. You get the basic description of what's done, and then you get the theological significance. Just look at what's said there. Now, this is what you shall do. Do here, azah, is perform a ritual. Remember Jesus saying, do this in remembrance of me, means perform this ritual, azah. So you do the offering. This is what you are to do at the altar. 2 lambs, a year old, each day as a regular enactment, tamid. You shall do 1 lamb in the morning, and another you shall do in the evening. And with the first lamb, 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour, mixed with 1/4 of a hin of oil from pressed olives, that's the best kind of olive oil, and 1/4 of a hin of wine for the drink offering. And the other lamb you shall do in the evening. You shall do with it a grain offering and its drink offering as in the morning. Now, here you're going to the bridging from here to the theological significance. For a pleasing aroma, a gift that belongs to the Lord, a regular burnt offering throughout your generations at the entrance to the tent of meeting before the face of the Lord. Two things I'd like to explain here, going backwards. First of all, the face, the panim, the presence of God here is very clearly identified as the altar. So where does God show his face? Where do Israelites have access to the face, the panim of God? It's at the entrance to the tent of meeting, the altar. By standing in front of the altar, they are in the panim, the presence of God. And the purpose of this offering is to present, to produce a pleasing aroma. An aroma, a gift that belongs to God. Now, the pleasing aroma consists of the following. By itself, if you burn flour, it produces a stinky smell. But that flour is mixed with the purest of pure olive oil, and it's mixed with very strong incense. And the flour is placed over meat, which is placed on red-hot coals. So what is the sweet aroma that's produced? Is the smell of barbecuing together with the smell of incense smoke. Now, who smells this? What is the smell? There's a fire there. The Israelites don't see the fire. Nobody sees the fire except the priest who's on top of the altar. What they see is the cloud that the fire produced. So you get fire in a cloud. And this cloud is what kind of a cloud? It's a sweet-smelling cloud. It's an incense-bearing cloud. Now, what's the symbolism here? It's sweet to whom? It's sweet to God, and therefore it means that God is pleased with this offering. He accepts not only the offering, but who does he accept? Who does he regard favourably? The people who bring it. So the offering represents the people. If God is sweet, is favourably disposed towards is pleased with the offering, he's pleased with the people who bring the offering. So it's sweet to God, but it's also sweet to who? The people. What do they smell when they stand in front of the altar out there?
Incense to barbecue.
They smell a meal. Incense, they smell a nice smell, which is incense, but they also smell food. And what does that incense tell them?
God's pleased.
That God is pleased with them. Can I emphasize that? That incense is, if you like, preaching. It preaches that God is pleased with them. It proclaims that God is pleased with them. It shows that God is sweet towards them. You get lots of references to this elsewhere in the Old Testament. The sweetness of God. That God is sweet with his people. He accepts their sacrifices. He's pleased with his people. He regards them with grace and favour. He's sweet towards them. Paul, by the way, uses incense in connection with the preaching of the gospel in the New Testament. And this is where he gets it from. But notice its double function. It's sweet to God, but it's also God's gift of his sweetness, his grace, his favour, his pleasure, his delight with his people. Somebody had hand up here?
Just purely gastronomical. Would that be kind of like a batter meat then? Because would flour and oil function as kind of batter? Or
No. Just think of it. You have an altar. And we know the details much more clearly from the temple. At the temple, it's a huge apparatus, and there's a boardwalk around the edges of it. Now, the first thing that happens in the morning is the priests on duty stoke the fire. They put aside all the unburned parts of the offerings on one side. They uncover the coals and put them all in one place. They put the ashes in 2 piles at the 2 corners of the altar where they are removed. Then, after they've removed the ashes, they heap all the coals in one place, and they get a very, very strong fire going, and they use wood that produces good coals. Not some wood, just burns, doesn't produce any coals, but some wood like mallee or red gum produces good coals. So they use timber that produces coals, and red hot coals, and that last. So they burn it until there's all that you've got left is coals, and then you spread the coals over the whole of the surface. Now, those coals are the holy fire that was lit by God himself, and the holy fire that was never to go out. It's a perpetual fire, the holy fire, God's fire. The coals are spread over the surface. Now, the priest then, the first thing, part of the offering, puts all the parts of the lambs on those coals. The animal's been slaughtered, puts the head here,
So wait,
4/4 here, and then what he does is basically covers the whole area of the altar with the bits and pieces of the lamb for burnt offering.
a grill or something, or a...
There's a grill underneath this.
Yeah, okay.
He puts it directly on the coal.
He puts it directly on the coals, right? So they will be charred, but they'll also get that barbecuing smell, but they won't burn. You see, they'll be charred, but meat doesn't burn unless you have something else to help it burn. Then that's the burnt offering. Then on top of that, then he puts this highly flammable stuff, which is this mixture of fine flour, not rough flour, but the very fine wheat flour, and that wheat flour is mixed with pure olive oil and incense, which is very flammable. And what he does is throws it all over the surface of that. And as soon as it hits the coals, what's going to happen to that flour offering? It'll go whoosh.
A lot of smoke.
But you won't see the fire. If you look at it, you can see the fire, but what it'll produce, because it's flour, is a cloud of dark smoke. And that will be produced here. Right? And then what's interesting, if I can get the full story then, all other offerings that people bring during the day are placed on the lamb. You see that? And at the end of the day, what happens? Another lamb is placed on top of all the other offerings. So you get a lamb, and then you get other offerings, and then you get a lamb in the evening. Notice how this encloses that. If I want to go to the New Testament, all our offerings to God are placed on and included in the great offering, which is Jesus himself. We pray, we present our offerings to God the Father through Jesus, together with Jesus. He includes our offerings in his offering to the Father. No? That's the picture here. Right? So there's that combination of food stuff. And as you know, when you pour good wine with a lot of alcohol on here, what's going to happen to the wine? It's going to burn too. Now, what's the significance of that? That's the law that legislates the daily offering. Now you get the significance of it here. And take notice of what God does. Well, okay, before the face of the Lord, where I will meet with you, plural. You, plural, means the Israelites. where I, God, will meet with you, plural, the Israelites, to speak to you, singular. Who's God speaking to? Moses, Aaron, the priest on duty. I will meet there, in case you haven't got it, with the children of Israel, so that they may be sanctified by my glory. God's glory is his hidden presence. That glory is revealed in that cloud of smoke and the sweetness from the cloud. What does that cloud do to the Israelites? That cloud makes God accessible. He meets with his people, and his presence there, that smoke, that incense, does what to the people? It makes them holy. It keeps them holy. It communicates his holiness to them, so that they are sanctified by the offering. And I will sanctify the tent of meeting. Now that's the holy place, and the altar. And I'll also sanctify Aaron and his sons to serve me as priests. And I will dwell in the midst of the children of Israel, so that I might be their God. Remember that from God's covenant with Abraham? He promised that he would be their God to them. Now that promise is fulfilled. God dwells with his people so that he can serve them as their God and act as their God here in the daily sacrifice. So that's God's side of it theologically. Okay, what does God do? He meets with his people, he speaks to his people through the priest, he sanctifies his people, and he dwells with his people so that he can serve them, act as their God. And as far as the people are concerned, theologically what happens? As a result of this, they get to know God. They get to know, so that they will know that I am the Lord, their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt to dwell among them. I am their God. I'm the Lord their God. Please look at that closely. You have the whole theology of worship contained there in practical terms. Yes, Michael?
Yeah, just wanted to ask you to repeat that again. The meets, speaks, sanctifies.
What? What are here? Number one, God meets with his people. Number one. Number two, God sanctifies his people, but also the priests and the whole place. And notice here that he doesn't just sanctify them at one point, it's an ongoing thing. Every day he shares his holiness with his people, with the priests, with the place. That's number two. No, number three. He meets with his people, he speaks with his people, he makes them holy. Number four, he dwells in their midst by means of the tabernacle, and he dwells in their midst. Number six actually, so that he can be their God. Now, there's something that's added. What God speaks to the priest and the priest speaks to the people. Do you know what the only word that the priests speak to the people from God is? The Aaronic benediction. So you could add to that, God meets with his people to speak what to them? Not judgment, but blessing to them. So God meets with his people to speak blessing to his people, to make and keep them holy, to share his holiness with them, so that he can dwell in their midst, so that he can serve them as their God. So, and the result of that is that they know him. Not know about him, but they get to know him personally as their God. The God who dwells, not up in heaven, but the God who dwells with them and meets with them here on earth. Any questions on that? Let's look at the next passage. I think, Vaughan, it's your turn. Could you please read Exodus 20, verse 24, where you have something filled out that I merely touched on just then. Exodus 20. Can you read from 22 to 24, please, Vaughan?
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven."
Now notice they're speaking from heaven. God speaking from heaven to his people on earth. That's the key term here.
"You shall not make other gods besides me, gods of silver or gods of gold, you shall not make for yourselves."
Right, if you see what follows, "Since I speak to you, therefore don't make any idols. Instead, what are you to make?"
"You shall make an altar of earth for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings, and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you."
In every place where I cause my name to be remembered has two ideas. In every place where I appear to you and say, "I am the Lord," that's the place where you are to build an altar, and that's where I will speak my name and you can speak my name. So every place where you have an altar where God speaks his name to his people, there God will do what? He will come in order to bless his people. So quite simply, the whole purpose of the daily burnt offering, the daily sacrifice, is for God to bless his people. You couldn't have anything more simple than that and more profound than that. God meets with his people to bless them. And what's being referred to here is the Aaronic benediction. You remember? The high point of the ritual is the priest saying, "Yahweh bless you, keep you. Yahweh make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up his face upon you and give you peace." Number 4, God appears in his glory in the fire on the altar. I've been speaking a lot in this course about theophany, and how theophany in Israel is different to pagan theophanies. Remember, pagan theophanies, a God appears and shows his or her face. Now God appears, and the theophany is a hidden theophany. He appears, but he appears in a cloud. He hides himself to show himself, to reveal himself. He conceals himself to reveal himself. Remember, at Mount Sinai, his glory is hidden in a cloud. And the same thing happens here at the daily sacrifice. Every morning, every evening, God shows his glory to his people. Let's read about that in the story from Leviticus 9, which describes the inauguration of the divine service. The first time the divine service was ever celebrated in Israel. So it's a foundational event. Could you, please, Chris, read those key passages, Leviticus 9, verse 6, and then 23 to 24.
Then Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded you to do, so that the glory of the Lord may appear to you."
Just stop there. So, and this then is described, this is the daily sacrifice. You are to do this every day in order that the Lord may appear in his glory to you. And how does God's theophany occur? Every morning, every evening. Go to the end of the description, verses 23 to 24.
Moses and Aaron then went into the tent of meeting. When they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat portions of the altar. And when all people saw it, they shouted for joy and fell facing him.
Now you need to realize at this point there was no holy fire. Moses and Aaron had placed the offerings on the altar. Now when they had completed the ritual, but the ritual was, there was no burning because there was no fire yet. They'd done everything except the burning here and here. Now the moment they came and stood in front of the altar and pronounced the Aaronic benediction on the people, what happened? Fire came from here and lit this and this. Fire comes from the presence of the Lord and sets alight the offering on the altar. And the people, when they see that, fall on their faces, prostrate themselves before the altar. because that fire is the fire of theophany. God appears to them in the glory. They probably didn't see anything of the fire itself because it's just dung like that. What they see then is the cloud that rises from the altar. Now what this story indicates is that theophany occurs, God's theophany occurs every morning and every evening whenever the burnt offering is presented on the altar. That is God's theophany to his people. And it's not a theophany in judgment. It's not an annihilating theophany. God doesn't come here to attack his enemies. But this is a theophany of blessing. God appears to his people in order to bless them. Hence, the coincidence of the two things. The moment the priest pronounced the blessing, that's when the fire comes and burns the offering. So this story connects that fire and blessing, God's glory and blessing, inseparably together. Hence you get the Aaronic benediction. And can you see which part of the Aaronic benediction refers to this event? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. Notice the shining face, the burning face, the fiery face, the lighting face of God. The fire of God's face. But it's not unfriendly fire, it's friendly fire, if I can use a military term. Any questions on that? Now, if you want to follow that through to New Testament and the Christian church, right from the beginning of the church, Christians held two things. One is that the theophany of God appears in Jesus Christ. Christ's incarnation, his ministry, but particularly his suffering, death, and resurrection is the theophany of God. God shows himself to humanity in Jesus. That's part of John's Gospel. The whole of John's Gospel unpacks that for us. But there's one step further. That, okay, Christ, as John says, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we have seen his glory. The glory is of the only one and only Son of God. Notice that have seen doesn't just indicate we saw it 2,000 years ago, but we have seen and we continue to see. We, the church, see the glory of Jesus. Where do we see the glory of Jesus, which is the glory of God? Follow this through. Where is the place of theophany for Christians? Preaching gospel, Lord's Supper. Where? What do you say?
I was saying altar.
The altar. Who's right?
Everyone.
All of you. It's in the divine service that theophany occurs. And if you wanted to focus on two particular points, it is what Lutherans call word and sacrament. The preaching of the gospel is preached for theophany. The sacrament is celebrated for theophany, and that's why we include the Song of Simeon after we've received Holy Communion. Have you ever thought about it? Lord, now let your servant depart in peace according to your word, for I have seen salvation. I've seen theophany, which you have prepared in the presence of all people, a light to lighten the Israelites, and the light to lighten the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel. So what is the light that brings light to Israel and glory to Israel and the Gentiles? Is Christ, whom we hold in our hands and receive in our hands in the sacrament. Theophany, that's the place. Now, if you want to understand the Eastern tradition of worship, Eastern Orthodox tradition of worship, you need to see that that's central to Orthodox theology. But it should also be central to our theology. Now, let's look at another passage much later. 2 Chronicles chapter 7, 12 to 16. Here we go now to Solomon and his dedication of the temple, because what applied to the tabernacle also applied later to the temple. 2 Chronicles chapter 7, 12 to 16. Please, Nathan, I think you're it.
The Lord appeared to him at night and said, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a temple for sacrifices. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command locusts to devour the land, or send a plague among my people, if my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land. Now my eyes will be open, and my ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. I have chosen and consecrated this temple, so that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there.
This is Solomon's, God appearing to Solomon after he had consecrated the temple. And you remember, when the temple was consecrated, the fire once again came from the holy place and lit up the altar a second time. So what happened at the consecration of the tabernacle also occurred at the consecration of the temple. Now, what does God say about the temple? The following things. Number one, it's a place of sacrifice, but it's also a place of prayer. Since it's a place of sacrifice, it's the place where the Israelites can come and petition their heavenly King here on earth. Thirdly, it's the place where God puts his name, writes his name, gives his name, so that they can access him in prayer. Thirdly, through the temple and the daily sacrifices there, the daily offerings there, God opens his ears and his eyes to his people. They have access to the ears of God, which means that they can petition them. They have access to the eyes of God so that they can meet with God, and God will show his favour, his grace to them. But most importantly, this is the place where they have access to the heart of God. Not just the face of God, but the heart of God. Look at that wonderful last sentence. I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever. Through the name then, my eyes and my heart will always be there. So, to put it most graphically, the temple and the daily burnt offering every morning, every evening, is the bridge between heaven and earth. Here, human beings can access their heavenly King on earth. Here the heavenly King comes down to meet with his people on earth, to see them, to show his grace and favour them, to hear them, and to open his heart to them so that they can have access, not just to him, but have access to his heart. Yes, Josh?
How is that phrase used, my heart? Is it sort of similar to the way we use it, like my sort of innermost self?
It's the innermost self. It's not feelings just, it includes feelings, but it's my innermost self.
So it's used in a very similar way in Hebrew as it is.
Yeah, except it's a bit broader, because we tend to think heart in terms of emotions. But heart is the whole innermost self, the soul of a person, if you like, the soul of God.
And does the word also refer to the thing that...
Yeah, the physical thing. So it is. It's the pump, which is the core of your being, the centre of your being. The most vulnerable, tender part of your body is the heart. So the heart of God. So through the divine service, heaven and earth is bridged, and Israel has access to the heart of God, the ears of God, the eyes of God. Now notice then, it's not just access to the face, that's the pagan idea. The idol has no real ears, no eyes, and you can't access the heart of a God through an idol. But this is what God offers his people in the daily sacrifice. Any questions on that? Now, let's see how's time going. So you have, what you need to distinguish is the public offerings of the Israelites from the private family offerings. And a lot of confusion arises for students and people who read the Bible and lump it all together. If I can explain it most practically, every morning, every evening, you get a very simple ritual is done in which one lamb is slaughtered, and that lamb is burnt on the altar. And together with that lamb, a couple of handfuls of flour are burnt on the altar. Now that's the public sacrifice, the public offering. Whether the Israelites are present there or not, it's done on their behalf by the priests every day. That's the public offering. For festive occasions, on the Sabbath and other occasions and other feasts, additional animals are presented. So instead, on the Sabbath day, instead of presenting one lamb, you present 2 lambs, and you present double the amount of flour. And then for the bigger festivals, you have additional animals. Now, and then thirdly, on festive occasions, another different kind of sacrifice. It's not just that the burnt offering and the cereal offering is presented, but a sin offering is presented in order to purify, cleanse the congregation and the sanctuary. So there were additional public sin offerings. Now, they are the public offerings. The main public offering is the combination of burnt offering and cereal or grain offering. Now, that is increased for festive occasions, and this is supplemented by a sin offering at the great festivals when the people come to meet with God. Now, next period, I'm going to be talking about the personal or private offerings, the family offerings. All Israelites would also bring their own family offerings to God, and they did it usually 2 or 3 times a year at the festivals. So we need to distinguish between public offerings and private personal offerings. Can you see the difference? The main public offering was the burnt offering. The main private offering was the peace offering, and that's what we'll need to focus on there. So, excuse me. Just very quickly, you have to go, do you? And I'll pick this up again. Can I take you through the daily ritual? Occurred in the following stages, and I'll be talking about the significance of this next lesson. The first thing in the morning is that the altar is prepared for sacrifice, and all the stuff that's needed for the sacrifice is prepared. No, the fire is stoked, etc., the ashes are removed. After that then, the animal, the lamb is slaughtered, blood is separated from the meat, and the animal is divided, and the stomach stuff is washed to get rid of all the offal. Then comes the first part of the ritual. The priest stands at this corner here and splashes half of the blood against the side of the altar here, and the other half of the blood against the side of the altar here. Gets rid of the blood against the altar. Then washes his hands and his feet, enters the holy place, burns incense here at the altar. Also, before that, then there's the trimming of the lamps, but that has no ritual significance, that's practical significance. So, burns incense. After he's burned incense, goes up the steps to the altar and puts on the altar the 3 lots of stuff there. There's the meat from the lamb, there's the flour mixed with olive oil and incense on the altar, and then the wine offering, the libation. When that's finished, the priest stands together with the other priests on duty in front of the altar and pronounces the Aaronic benediction to the people. And the last thing the priest does then is takes the leftover flour and olive oil and bakes and makes bread from it. Now, since that flour, part of that flour has been placed on the altar, the flour now is most holy, and the bread that's made from that is most holy. And if it's most holy, what does it do to the priests who eat it here? It conveys God's holiness to the priests. They eat God's holiness by eating the most holy bread. Does that ring a bell with you? It should.